Avatar: The Last Airbender, an undeniably iconic piece of art. When I was growing up, this is what the cool kids watched, while the rest of us were watching Ed, Edd and Eddy. Avatar was an incredibly mature show for both its time and for the audience it was made for. I don't remember any shows as a kid that respected my ability to understand complex plot lines or emotions like grief, and characters in the series deal with that on a regular basis. I think the risk that the creators took to present a show that didn't fit the mold is what allowed it to flourish and continue building popularity over time. So today, let's look at some lore, urban legends, and behind-the-scenes action. But first, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It'll bring you more videos like this right to your homepage. Without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy the Avatar Iceberg Explained. As always, let's start out at level 1. Azula's Blue Flames. We all love a good villain, and Azula was a menace. I think we can all agree on that. From the first moment you're introduced, you can tell she's going to bring trouble for the rest of the series. And what better way to kick off this iceberg than with one of Avatar's most villainous characters? When Azula's on screen, it's hard to look away. Her skill with firebending is evident, and it's well supported by her father, Fire Lord Ozai, and her brother Zuko. But what's another way that you can tell that the good times are over and Azula's there to throw down? It's not the dull red flames of your everyday 9-to-5 firebender, but the brilliant blue flames of a once-in-a-generation talent. That seems to be the long and short of it. Her blue flames are nothing more and nothing less than pure skill in firebending. Not only are her blue flames a visual sign that she has surpassed most practitioners, they also burn hotter than yellow, orange, and red flames. In fact, if you look at the color of flame in relation to its temperature, you'll find this to be true in the real world. Yellow and red are cooler than blue, and in between them are white flames, which we see from Rangi described in the Rise of Kyoshi novel. Worth noting that even though white is hotter than red, it's still not as hot as blue. Begging the question, what comes after blue? Well, in the real world, we would say purple. And in fact, there are only 2 other times where we see purple flames, from Ran and Shaw, the firebending dragons, and in the post-animated series comic Smoke and Shadow, where Zuko redirects some blasts of fire, turning it into a vortex of flame with hints of green and purple. The only way to get hotter would be to have infrared flames, or microwave bending. I don't really know how that would work, but it sounds like a cool idea for an arc. Honestly, it sounds a little bit like combustion bending. Airbenders survived. Here's one of the story points that I think set apart the series. The Air Nation genocide. It's obviously a deeply emotional topic, and it takes a lot of guts to bring such a serious concept to a kids' show. As we saw in the animated series, the Fire Nation orchestrated ruthless raids on the air nomads and their temples, all but wiping out the nation from existence. But what if Aang wasn't the only one who escaped a death sentence? What if other airbenders made it out or hid long enough to evade the murderous campaign of the Fire Nation? Now, because the Air Nation was inherently a nomadic people, it's true that wiping them all out would have been particularly difficult. Not only that, but their bending in particular lends itself well to evading and escaping. Sure, during the comet, firebending powers were heightened, so much so that maybe some of them could fly, or maybe they had dragons to get at the temples. No one really knows for sure. But if an air nomad could evade the Fire Nation for just a little bit, I'm sure they could have kept in hiding for a while. We do know that the Fire Nation did try to round up any airbenders who escaped. They placed artifacts in abandoned temples to make them appear like safe places for refugees, while hiding a trap to wipe out the remaining airbenders. But what if they didn't get all of them? If we make parallels to real life, I think it's entirely possible that some airbenders escaped, or were otherwise sheltered by someone else. Potentially even firebending families who didn't agree with Fire Lord Sozin's politics. In fact, it's entirely possible that some of those genetics were passed down and would eventually be expressed in a new generation of airbenders. We'll see some evidence of genetics at play further down the iceberg. Fire Nations Inspiration. The Fire Nation is obviously the big bad guy in the series. They have a bending style that is inherently violent and destructive, except for you, Uncle Iroh. Keep being you. It makes perfect sense for them to be the antagonist. But what could have inspired such a violent and deadly regime? Let's take a look at the geography of the nation to start. Notice anything familiar? Unlike the other nations of the Avatar world, it's clearly a series of islands off the coast of a larger landmass. I think its most obvious comparison is Japan. Now, before people get all upset, the nations and cultures that make up Avatar are inspired by a host of different real-world societies. True, many of them are Eastern countries like Japan, China, India, and Korea, but there are many inspirations for different parts of each nation. That said, the political context of the show reflects very closely the political stance of imperialist Japan. I'll let this article from Sci-Fi elaborate. Quote, "The closest inspiration for the Fire Nation comes from the era immediately following the Meiji. The Taisho era was marked by heightened militarization along with the Empire of Japan's encroachment into and colonization of other Asian countries, leading into the events of World War II, which fell under the Showa era. From the voiceover in Avatar's opening sequence, we find out that the Fire Nation began a war 100 years ago and has been attacking the other nations since, decimating them and conquering them in a bid to control the entire world. The Fire Nation is militarized and structured around a totalitarian monarch, the Fire Lord, as the head of the nation." End quote. Man, that was a mouthful. In the words of Fire Lord Sozin himself, quote, "Our nation is experiencing an unprecedented time of peace and wealth. Our people are happy, and we're so fortunate in so many ways. We should share this prosperity with the rest of the world. In our hands is the most successful empire in history. It's time we expanded it." This one is pretty high on the list because I think it's pretty commonly accepted, but it's still nonetheless very interesting because it's one area where we continue to see how real-world events influenced the series. Lava bending. The Legend of Korra really expanded the Avatar world. I remember watching it in college as a way to re-experience some of the nostalgia I remember from the original series, and I remember not liking it very much at the start. The series quickly grew on me though, and though I don't remember it as much as the original, I do love how they expanded more on the lore and added all kinds of new bending techniques into the mix. Lava bending was one of those new techniques. It was an exceedingly rare technique that we discovered one of the protagonists, Bolin, to possess. And man, it is one of the cooler bending techniques I remember, except for maybe bloodbending. Nickelodeon was wild for that. There were also attempts to force out this strange bending technique by placing earthbenders in a volcano and hoping that the adrenaline and peril would allow them to awaken lava bending techniques. This was an utter failure, and all the test subjects were believed to have died. I don't think it's ever been super clear as to why lava bending is a subskill of earthbending and not firebending. In fact, in an early Avatar book, lava bending is explained as a combination of both earthbending and firebending, but it was later retconned to be a subskill of earthbending. What's confusing to me is that when we see lava bending in action, it looks a lot more like water bending than anything. The flow and control required seem to be much more reminiscent of controlling water rather than fire. In fact, the sound effects used for lava bending are actually modified sounds of flowing water. If anything, maybe this really was just a way to strengthen the case for the Avatar, and all the bending styles really do just descend from one unifying bending style. But to understand more about that, we'll have to move down to level 2. Brutal Gyatso. Our good friend Gyatso, the master airbender who mentored Aang before he sealed himself off for 100 years. I still remember the episode where Aang makes it to the air temple only to discover that all his friends have long since passed, likely at the hands of Fire Nation soldiers during the genocide. Among the old friends that are discovered that day is the skeleton of Gyatso, and surrounding him is a room full of dead Fire Nation soldiers. Now, There are a couple points to note from this. First and foremost, despite the playful attitude and fighting techniques that Gyatso displayed while he was alive, there's no doubt about it. He was an absolute master of the airbending technique. Aang even called him the best airbender in the world when he was alive. Second, he undeniably killed the firebenders that he was surrounded by, which makes it the first and only time in the original series that we see an airbender responsible for killing people. That is, if you don't count all those things that Aang did, but we'll get to those later. Lastly, let's talk about the manner in which Gyatso's body is found. Notably, there are no burns or scorch marks on his clothes, leading some to speculate that Gyatso used a frowned upon or forbidden technique to fight off the benders. It's not clear to me if the fire in the Avatar world requires oxygen to burn, and if it does, that would give a pretty big advantage to an airbender, especially if they were in a closed-off space. What if, backed against a wall, Gyatso used a bending technique that literally sucked the air out of the room, leaving no oxygen for the Fire Nation to bend, and no oxygen for them to breathe? Gyatso went down swinging, taking as many Fire Nation soldiers with him as he could, and no one can tell me otherwise. Original Toph. Toph has to be one of the best characters in the series, and that is in large part due to a decision made late in the game to change Toph's design entirely. Instead of the short, blind little girl, Toph's original design was that of a tall, muscular jock type. This design seems to have had the purpose of being the foil to Sokka, the opposite. While Sokka was the intellectual, original Toph was the muscle, brain, and brawn. We still got that, just in a different form. Now, supposedly the reason for this change was simply that showrunners Brian Konietzko and Michael Dante DiMartino supposedly thought that the version of Toph that eventually made it to the finished show would be funnier. That seeing a little girl beat up big bad guys twice or 3 times her size would resonate better with audiences. And I think they were right. Toph stands as one of the most memorable characters in the series, and one of the few that actually made me laugh. One more fun fact about this version of Toph is that you can actually see him in the series. In fact, you see him in every episode. That's right, the Earthbender that you see in the title sequence, water, earth, fire, and air, is the original character design for Toph. In addition, if you watch the original pilot episode, which I'll get to later on, you can see a short intro for each of the Team Avatar friends. And when the earthbending section comes up, you can see the original version for Toph in action. Ty Lee, the Airbender. Alright, I will admit, this one is a little bit of a stretch, and Airbender is definitely misleading. Let's think back to a topic from not too long ago, the survival of airbenders from the original Fire Nation attacks. Imagine for a moment again that there was a family somewhere along the line in the Fire Nation that was sympathetic to the struggles of the people from the Air Nation. And imagine they stumbled across a group of hiding Air Nation refugees. Rather than turning them into the government, maybe they instead chose to provide shelter. Maybe they provided shelter long enough for those refugees to blend into the Fire Nation as everyday citizens, eventually going so far as to integrate with their society to survive. Those refugees might have one day had children that would have passed down and spread the airbending genes amongst the people of the Fire Nation. In fact, I would go as far to say that this almost definitely happened. If we know anything about Avatar: The Last Airbender, we know that it was inspired by real-world culture and events. There's nothing more real-world than someone breaking with the authoritarian rule of their country to shelter refugees against the will of their government. So, now imagine all this happened, and then fast forward a few generations. Suddenly, it's entirely plausible that Ty Lee, the Fire Nation circus performer, actually has airbender genes in her DNA. This would explain a few things. Well, she's obviously an acrobat. There's no reason that she should be able to jump 15 feet in the air. Maybe a little bit of airbending genes gives you a few more inches, or feet, of vertical. And there's also her self-reported ability to read auras, an indisputably spiritual aspect of her character. And most characters, except Aang, who's constantly meditating, lack that skill. This latent spirituality could be the lingering influence of her great-great-great-grandfather in Airbender. Aang's lost son. We don't know a whole lot about what happened in between the conclusion of The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra, but we do know a few things. We know that Aang and Katara did get together and ended up having kids. We also know that Aang supposedly dies of old age in his mid-60s, about 6 or so years before the start of The Legend of Korra. What we don't know is if we're actually seeing all of Aang's kids, or if there was possibly a secret fourth child that we saw plenty of, but never knew was related to Aang. That's right, this theory proposes that Zahir, the antagonist of the third season, and the grittiest airbender of them all, is actually the forgotten and discarded son of Avatar Aang. There's a few ideas that contribute to this theory. The first being that the new airbenders that appear in the season thanks to Korra are not actually random, but were in some way related to the original airbenders that fled the Fire Nation attacks during the 100-Year War. The point being that the new airbenders actually had some sort of genetic disposition to becoming benders, meaning that Zahir had a predisposition to becoming an airbender. Also, Zahir seems to have both lots of knowledge about the historical air nomads and respect for their spirituality. Now, I'm not totally sure, but I kind of doubt that he could have learned that on his own, unless he were close to someone that could teach him. And what better teacher than someone that lived in the Air Temple 150 years ago? His potential father, Aang. So, while we'll probably never get any confirmation, and it's probably not true, I, for one, think that the resemblance between the two is pretty uncanny, minus the blue arrow, of course. And speaking of hairstyles, let's move down to level 3. Zuko's hair. If you watched our boy Zuko through the entire series, you'll note that while most everyone's hairstyle remains the same, Zuko goes through many different stages. In fact, he goes through as many hairstyles as he does changes and points of redemption in his character arc. When we first encounter Zuko, he has what can only be described as the world's worst top knot, and that seems to reflect how terrible of a person he is when we first meet him. Then we see a banished version of Zuko, one who's chopped off the top knot in favor of a more low-profile haircut that reflects him trying to blend in with the crowd while serving tea with Uncle Iroh. Third, his redemption arc begins, but before that we see a mop of hair that seems to reflect how lost he is. Rather than the tidy haircut that we see before and after, the hairstyle screams, I have no idea what I'm doing or where I'm going, and I'm angry about it. Trust me, we've all been there. Finally, we see Zuko in the last episode, redemption arc fully realized and top knot back on his head, albeit this time it looks much better. I don't think there's really any way to deny this theory. His hairstyle perfectly reflects his journey and signifies his growth over the series. But what do you think? Intro benders. It's not often that you remember the title sequence of a show. In fact, the title sequence is rarely included in shows anymore. So when you hear water, earth, fire, air, and are immediately transported back to the couch after school, how can you not recognize greatness? But who are those characters in the intro of the show? Back when I was a kid, I used to think they were all different incarnations of the Avatar from different eras, but now we know for sure that one of them is actually the original Toph, so I'm not so sure. If you skipped ahead, by the way, go back to level 1, you cheater. So, we know the Earthbender, but what about the Waterbender? Well, that distinction goes to Pakku. You might remember Pakku as the old waterbending instructor that originally refused to teach Katara how to waterbend. Well, it turns out he was widely believed to be the strongest waterbender while he was alive. It's no wonder that he got the distinction of being in the intro, and because he's the first in the opening sequence, he's actually the first character in the series that is seen bending in any way, shape, or form. Now, the Firebender. This one is a little bit more obvious, and if I've primed you with the first few topics in the video, you might already recognize her. It's, of course, Azula, the firebending prodigy. As possibly the most talented firebender of her generation, it makes sense that she would take the spot in the intro scene. Lastly, we have the Airbender drop into the scene. A lot of people incorrectly say that the Airbender is Aang, but that's not quite true. If you look very closely, the figure in the scene appears to have a mustache, meaning it can't possibly be Aang. The fandom wiki lists him as an unknown air nomad, though when you read through the fan series, the common suggestion is Gyatso, Aang's original mentor from before the 100-Year War. And if you really zoom in, that mustache seems pretty accurate. Glass bending. Here we have another subsection of earthbending. We started with lava bending, but here's another one that I didn't realize at the time was in fact distinct from earthbending. We first encounter sandbenders when the gang is trapped in the desert. They're cruising around in their sand sailors, stealing Appa, and Aang almost kills them. He definitely destroys their mode of transportation, though, stranding them in the middle of the desert, and I don't know how they got out of that. But that tribe, specifically the Siwang tribe, is the one made up of sandbenders, distinct in that they bend individual grains of sand rather than solid earth. Historically, glassbenders were sandbenders first, who then learned how to glassbend, though it was possible for regular earthbenders to learn as well. Sand and glassbenders would make glass by focusing on individual grains of sand and superheating them, melting them into their glass forms, and then wielding it much in the same way as a waterbender would. In fact, glassbending is said to be very, very similar to lava bending, and we've already discussed how similar that seems to waterbending. I guess the main difference here is the level of control needed. When we see earthbenders, they're typically moving around huge chunks of earth and don't really need all that much control. With sand, you're lifting something tiny, and control is needed. Apply that to glassbending, and it's no wonder earthbenders don't have the innate skill required. Honestly, I love these little extensions to the bending world, but sometimes they feel like they were good ideas at the start, but there are so many weird rules about bending that have to be retconned each time a new bending style shows up that you have to wonder if it was actually thought all the way through. Use meteor. One of the sweeter entries on this list involves Yu. I'll forgive you if you don't exactly remember Yu. She was not present on the screen for very long, but she was one of the most emotional departures and maybe one of the first indications that this show wasn't going to pull any punches just because it was for kids. Yu was the princess of the northern tribe that was born with some unknown illness. The moon spirit gifted some of its own life force to Yu, saving her life. The balance was later restored when Yu sacrificed herself to restore that of the moon spirit, returning the waterbending abilities to all of the tribes. That's the background, and Yu disappears from the show quite early, showing up occasionally as a reference from Sokka, drunk on cactus juice, and then again to guide and save Aang's life after getting zapped by Azula. Other than that, we don't see much from Yu, except for one fan theory that shows the affection from Sokka is not entirely one-sided. In Season 3, Sokka goes through the process of disguising himself as a member of the Fire Nation and training in the art of sword fighting. As part of this process, he must make his own sword, and decides to incorporate a meteor as part of the material in that sword. What if, as a personification, or spiritification of the moon, Yu was actually responsible for sending that meteor? Given the connection between the moon, space, and meteors, it's not an enormous leap to make. Sokka clearly had a connection with Yu, and maybe Yu found a way to return some of that affection after her sacrifice. Energy bending. This seems to be one of the more hotly debated components of the Avatar series, and I suppose it's for good reason. It was the finale of the series, and to many people, the manner in which Aang both learns about and uses energy bending felt poorly executed, lazy, and a bit too convenient. So, what's the argument? Basically, the third and final season of Avatar: The Last Airbender is 21 episodes long. Aang meets the lion turtle in episode 19 and learns about energy bending only 2 episodes before the series concludes. Aang is presented with his hardest decision approaching his battle with Ozai: either lose to him and die, dooming the world to an even more powerful Fire Nation, or kill him, saving the rest of the world. This is a direct contradiction to Aang's arc for the past 3 seasons, as he famously refuses to kill, taking a pacifist approach instead. So, entering this battle and concluding with Aang not having to make either decision feels like a slap in the face to some viewers. On top of this, the fact that he is given the solution to his problem by a god 2 episodes earlier is literally the definition of Deus Machina. And I'd agree on that point. I do think there could have been some more foreshadowing that laid the groundwork for energy bending. That said, after reading a few different opinions on the ending, I don't fully agree that it was a lazy ending. In fact, I think it might actually be the perfect ending for Aang's character. Throughout the series, he's always finding other ways to do things, to avoid violence, to avoid killing, kind of in the same way that Batman doesn't kill anyone. And faced with his tallest task, rather than succumbing to the world, he completes his arc as a savior figure by not compromising himself. Whether it was intended this way or not, Aang likely would have been the only character in the series capable of energy bending due to his steadfast character. According to the Lion Turtle, the true mind can weather all the lies and illusions without being lost. The true heart can tough the poison of hatred without being harmed. Aang's true mind and heart are what allowed him to use energy bending and come out unscathed. So, in the end, I'll give it a satisfactory way of ending the story. But our story's not over. We need to go deeper, to level 4. Lion Turtle plot holes. Speaking of the Lion Turtles, let's talk a little bit more about them and their role in the Avatar universe. We're first introduced to them in the lead-up to Aang's battle with Ozai, but we see much more of them in The Legend of Korra. Honestly, the Lion Turtles were a little bit weird to me. Their lore felt like it didn't quite fit within the already established lore of the world, and in some cases it seemed to undermine what we already knew about bending. For example, we're introduced to the dragons in Avatar: The Last Airbender, and to the civilization that worshipped and learned from them, the Sun Warriors. The Sun Warriors were supposedly the first tribe of human firebenders in the world, which they learned from the dragons. However, as soon as the Lion Turtles are introduced, we're all instead told that all humans were granted the ability to firebend whenever they were out hunting. That seems to cheapen the idea of firebending to me, and it makes more sense as an art that was studied and eventually mastered rather than something that was gifted. There are also different lion turtles roaming around, each attuned to a different element: water, earth, fire, or air. And in turn, they each grant that power to the humans on their back. So let's talk about waterbending. While the lion turtle could grant this, we're also told by you that the original waterbenders learned by watching the push and pull effect that the moon had on the tides. To take away that lore and replace it with the lion turtle touched my head and now I can bend feels cheap to me. Instead, I have my own theory. I know we're told about the lion turtles in a way that is basically canon, but what if instead the lion turtles are more akin to fables or biblical stories of creation? They were stories that different regions came up with to ascribe spiritual explanations to physical phenomena. In some narrations of the story, there were lion turtles that gifted bending, but on the other side of the world, dragons did the teaching. And at the poles, watching the tide taught waterbending. I don't know. I think I just prefer those explanations of bending over it being a gift from the lion turtles, but what do you think? Avatar U. Let's go back to Yu for a really fascinating fan theory. The story goes that Yu, who we talked about earlier, was born with an unknown illness, which was not so much an illness, but more of just an endless slumber. It takes the moon spirit in order for her to be woken or healed from that slumber. So what was her illness? What caused it? And why was a spirit able to fix her? Well, the theory goes that when Aang fled the air temples and eventually froze himself solid for 100 years, he messed up the Avatar process and the balance in whatever system was managing that. When he did that, the process continued without the ability for the Avatar spirit to inhabit a new human host. Enter you, a baby born with a mysterious illness that looked more like a deep slumber. What if you was supposed to be the avatar after Aang, but because of his suspended state, was born before the avatar spirit could get to her, leaving her in a state of deep sleep? Because her illness was caused by the lack of a spirit, the only thing capable of reviving her was in fact another spirit. I really like this theory, but there are a couple holes in it. I'm just going to talk about the most glaring one. The Avatar is based on a theme of reincarnation. So it doesn't quite make sense that a baby would have been born without a spirit, as it seems more likely that the spirit just finds a new host when it needs to. Whether or not that happens exactly at the time of birth, I don't know if that's ever explained. So, while it's a really cool theory, I do think it undermines the story around the theme of the Avatar in a way that probably makes it unlikely to be true, but it's still a fun one. Animal guide bonds. We all know that these bonds run deep. The friendship between Aang and Appa is nigh unbreakable, and we've seen the same thing with other avatars. Roku had a dragon, and Korra had Naga. Even the first avatar, Wan, has an animal companion, Mula, who is a cat deer. As an aside, this just kind of reinforces my idea that when The Legend of Korra came out, they just started stretching for some ideas. But anyways, we know these bonds are strong, but how strong are they? Is it possible that their very lives are tied together, and that the death of one would ensure the death of the other? As far as I can tell, most of the evidence for this theory is based on the fact that Roku and his companion dragon, Fang, died together. Now, it's pretty clear that the death of one didn't cause the death of the other in this case. Fang chose to die with Roku, laying down with him as an erupting volcano overtook them. But maybe you could argue that their bond compelled Fang to join Roku. Either way, despite the sad ending for both, they do end up in the spirit world together, so they seem like they're doing fine. The other piece of evidence is a little bit lacking. The main idea is that we know Aang is dead and Appa is nowhere to be found. It's assumed that however Aang died, if it really was from old age, Appa was right there with him in the end. As far as the canon goes, Aang died of old age because all that time spent trapped in the ice took a toll on him. And so who knows, maybe Appa, having spent the same amount of time, was also ready to move on. On-aired Avatar pilot. Did you know that there's actually a readily available version of an on-aired pilot that you can watch? As the industry goes, the show creators would have had to pitch the series to Nickelodeon with a pilot episode in order to pique their interest. In it, we see all kinds of interesting details, ever so slightly different than the final version of the show that made it to air. Starting at the character design, you can see the main characters, except for Toph, as we covered earlier, look very similar to their final versions, though I will say there was some significant polish put on them between the pilot and the real first episode. Aang and Zuko look very close to their finished versions, but Katara and Sokka have had some work done. Speaking of Katara, that was a big change. Katara's original name in the series was going to be Kaya. The official reason for the change was one of trademarking. It seems another video game character already had the name Kaya locked down, so they had to change it. On to Sokka. Supposedly, the original version for his character was actually much meaner than the version we saw in the finished series. The character we saw was more of a snarky, sarcastic one. I, for one, am glad that they made that switch. On to the other not-so-tiny detail that you'll notice in the pilot. Aang enters the Avatar state in the very first episode, and he does so to overcome what is a pretty standard battle. If you watched the actual series, you'll know that it essentially takes Aang the entirety of the series to master the Avatar state. Well, in this version, he does it effortlessly on day one. It's worth noting that this was probably never the actual intention. It was likely a way for the creators to tease the full potential of the show, so they pulled out all the stops and powered up Aang all the way. The good news is, it worked. But I'm also glad that they upped the stakes for Aang to enter the Avatar state, rather than making it easy for him to solve any issue by turning into an almighty bender at the drop of a hat. The episode is pretty easy to find. Go check it out. You can just Google it. The fight scenes are actually so well done despite it being such a low-budget creation. It's just fascinating to see where it started and where it ended up. Aang's dark side. Speaking of Aang, he is famous through the whole series specifically for not killing anyone. Even the Fire Lord in the climax of the series gets spared. He repeatedly comments on how he avoids violence, except as a last resort, and he never uses it to kill. But let's explore for a moment just how merciful Aang really is. There are a few moments that come to mind, but we'll start back with those sandbenders that stole Appa in the desert. Now, Aang justifiably freaks out, but then he takes it a step further and begins entering the Avatar state in an uncontrollable fashion, and almost murders them in cold blood, but stops short thanks to Katara. That said, he definitely destroyed the stand sailor that they were using to traverse the desert, leaving them stranded. I'm not sure what odds they had of making it all the way back to their village on foot, but I'm sure they managed, right? But also right off the bat in the first season, when Aang is in the form of the Ocean Spirit, he's destroying Fire Nation soldiers left and right, sweeping them into the ocean with massive tidal waves and blasting them with what must be an immensely powerful force of water. I think that being thrown into the icy water in the middle of the night is not great for your odds of survival. He also demolishes like a dozen warships, which probably had whole battalions of people on board that were just wiped out. Sinking ships are not famously great for survival either. And then there was also that time at the Northern Air Temple where a bunch of fire soldiers were up on the cliffs. Aang zooms by and creates an avalanche that almost certainly sweeps them off the edge. Other air temples are shown to have a 3,000-foot elevation, so I think it's safe to assume that no one was surviving a fall off that mountain. But anyways, if you didn't see the death on screen, we'll just assume cartoon physics. I'm sure those Fire Nation soldiers just rode the snow down to the base of the mountain and everything was okay. Keeping it in the family. Think for a moment about the characters that we see lightning bending. It's a skill that's pretty far and few between. For the most part, it's a technique that is restricted to the upper levels of the Fire Nation government, and not something that has slowly trickled down into the lower tiers of society. In fact, look at the royal family in general. Almost all of them are powerful benders in their own right, and in a world where your bending ability is in part determined by your genetics, how might you keep those genes strong? That's right, the theory goes that in order to maintain the power of the royal line, the family very much kept it in the family. And let's look outside the fictional world for a second. We know, of course, that much of Avatar was inspired by the real world, and what's more real world than a royal family arranging marriages both for political reasons and to keep their bloodline quote-unquote pure? What's interesting is that unlike in the real world, there aren't necessarily any benefits for inbreeding. Humans don't actually have magical powers like they do in Avatar or Harry Potter. There isn't any actual reason to maintain a bloodline. In the Avatar world, on the other hand, we know that bending is in fact genetic, and were a royal heir to be born without the ability to bend, they would likely be a disgrace, at least in the Fire Nation. So there's a good reason to separate yourselves from other gene pools. The counter to this theory, though, is that the royal family didn't actually have the best bloodline, they just had the best training, which again reflects what you see in the real world. The child of a world-class athlete might have some genetics that give them a slight leg up, but in reality, they have access to the best training and coaching in the world. If they end up being an all-star, it's most likely the training and not the genes. In the same way, the royal family members were able to learn how to lightning bend not because of their genes, but because of incredible training and coaching. What do you think? Was bending power based more on genetics or on training? Is it more talent or skill? Let me know in the comments, and while you're typing, we'll move down to level 5. Azula's redemption arc. We've almost come full circle. We started with Azula, and now let's revisit her. As we know, she is one of the main villains in the series, and alongside her brother, they introduce us to a Fire Nation that is ruthless both in their politics and in how they raise their children, training them from a young age to be warriors and killers. Prince Zuko begins the series as an antagonist to Aang, hell-bent on capturing him and turning him into his father. Which, as a side note, if you watch back with the context of the full series, Ozai was definitely going to kill Aang. There's no question about that. I think my childhood brain thought that he was just going to beat him up or something, but we all know the Avatar world is much more ruthless than that. But anyways, as the series progresses, we continue to follow Zuko, who becomes more and more conflicted with his role in the current world, until eventually we see the full redemption arc of his character, even going so far as to battle his sister, Azula, to complete that arc. But what if I told you that even Azula was capable of change and redemption? And what if I told you that originally she was also planned to have a redemption arc that might have outshined even Zuko's? I'll read from head writer Aaron Ehas, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, who wrote on Twitter, or X, 5 years ago about the plot line he intended for Azula. Quote, "I always intended for Azula to have a redemption arc in the story of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Longer and far more complicated than Zuko's. She had not bottomed in the end of Season 3, she had further to go. At the deepest moment in her own abyss, she would have found Zuko. Despite it all, her brother Zuko would have been there for her, believing in her, sticking by her, doing his best to understand and help her hold her pain that she could no longer hold alone. Zuko, patient, forgiving, and unconditionally loving, all strengths he gained from Uncle Iroh. That's how she would have gotten out and changed, with the faith and love of someone she had hurt, but who stuck by her anyway, just as he had been saved by faith and love from someone he had hurt, but who stuck by him. I also imagined that after coming out the other side, she would have been one of those people who hilariously overshares her own feelings all the time, and that she would have been a bit over-apologetic, like a Canadian version of Azula." End quote. Honestly, with the way that Zuko's arc was written and choreographed, I would have loved to see Azula's. Fifth Nation. The world of Avatar: The Last Airbender is famously divided into 4 nations. I've probably talked about the intro scene like 5 times at this point. Water, earth, fire, air. But what if I told you there was once a 5th nation? Not one with its own unique bending technique, but a melting pot of the other 4 nations. One where water, earth, fire, and air benders all got along. That would be a little bit misleading, as by all accounts it wasn't so much a nation as it was a roaming band of pirates. They did exist for quite some time though, and were influential enough to be considered their own nation with their own culture. That said, the 5th nation itself was less diverse than they would have had you believe. Despite claiming to be a nation and society with, quote, no avatars and no masters, they were largely made up of individuals formerly from the Southern Water Tribe. While they might have been more diverse than other nations, it seems this was the case largely because of an early treaty signed between them and the Fire Nation, meaning that the Pirate Nation was slightly more likely to have firebenders in their ranks. That said, when you live on the water, firebending isn't going to do you much good. It's not really clear if they had many or any earth and airbenders in their ranks, but based on how they went about kidnapping civilians from Earth tribes in the future, I'm guessing they didn't have many as part of their crew. The nation doesn't really exist by the time we see Aang running around, as it was largely destroyed on 2 different occasions. Once by a master airbender who summoned an enormous storm that sunk and killed most of the pirate nation, and then a second time when the nation tried to kidnap the Avatar and instead kidnapped the Avatar's friend, causing the actual Avatar to unleash the wrath of the Avatar state on their boats and crew. Honestly, based on the background I've read from this 5th nation, I'm surprised they survived as long as they did. World size. Speaking of the nations of the Avatar world, how big do you think their world actually is? We see a map quite often, but it really only shows the 4 nations, which seem to be made mostly up of chains of islands. The map we often see is laid out in a way as if to imply it represents the entire globe, and if that's the case, then how big is the planet that Aang and his friends live on? Let's start with what I think is probably the most boring of those schools of thought, that the world is essentially the same size as Earth. There's not a lot of lore here, it just seems like the easy answer, but I don't think that's necessarily the truth. So let's do some math and try to figure it out. First, let's look at a few different methods of calculating its size. On the world map, we can see very clearly the outline of Ba Sing Se. Let's be as generous as possible and call it roughly the size of New York City. New York has an area of about 300 square miles. Let's be generous and give the intersection of Ba Sing Se an area of 500 square miles, almost twice that of New York City. Now we'll remember our middle school math, and we'll work out that if the city is 500 square miles, then the diameter of the inner rim is about 25 miles. Extrapolate that out, and based on the world map that we can see, you get a planet with a circumference of only about 650 miles. For comparison, the circumference of Earth is about 25,000 miles. The circumference of Pluto is about 4,600 miles. So we're talking about a planet about the 10th the size of Pluto. That's tiny. In fact, for comparison, if you drove from the top of California to the bottom, that's about 750 miles. So 100 miles further than it would take to drive around the Avatar world. That seems way too small for me, so let's try another way. We're going to assume that Ba Sing Se is actually much larger than New York, and is in fact a megacity that houses most of the nation's people, however many people that is. Earth King Ying Ming once said that it takes 2 days to walk from one side of Ba Sing Se to the other. Now let's give the benefit of the doubt and assume that they're walking at a good pace for 2 days straight. 4 miles per hour is a very fast walk, but let's assume they keep it up for 48 hours. That makes the diameter of Ba Sing Se 192 miles. Using the same math as before, that gives us an Avatar world with a circumference of about 5,800 miles, which honestly is about 25% bigger than Pluto, which doesn't seem like a bad estimate. The other idea I'll say here is, what if the map isn't showing the entire planet? There's a good chance that it's only zoomed in on a small section of the world. And if that's the case, imagine that there's actually a whole other half of the planet, half the world we've never seen. What could be there? Entirely new elemental forms of bending? If you have any theories, let me know in the comments. Original sketch. I put this one at the bottom not because it's the most secretive of all the topics on here, but rather that I think it's the most interesting and inspiring part of the iceberg. Back when Tumblr was a thing, Brian Konietzko posted some of his original sketches that inspired the series, along with an inspirational message. Quote, "Just keep drawing and follow the characters on the page wherever they may take you." End quote. I don't know why, but it's just a relief that the series hasn't been spoiled by some revelation that the creators are terrible people or something. It's stood the test of time and has remained a testament to great storytelling, world building, and character development. Speaking of character development, let's take a look at that original sketch. As Brian mentions, this is the first sketch of the Avatar universe. Some elements are the same. It's interesting to me that even the first sketch of Aang had a tattoo arrow on his head. In fact, all the characters have arrows on their heads. Aang also still had a staff, albeit a futuristic-looking one. Other things, though, have changed quite a bit. For example, take a look at Momo. Yes, he is still a sort of small companion, but in the original sketch, he was actually a Cyclops robot monkey guide, which is a really interesting idea. Momo in the series that we know is a mute companion, more animal than guide. He doesn't really have any intelligence in the way that would help Aang navigate the world. This robot, on the other hand, is shown pointing in the very first sketch, which would seem to imply that he has an intelligence to offer Aang. Also, instead of Appa being there with Aang, we got a bipedal version of Naga, who, despite not appearing in Avatar: The Last Airbender, does make a return as Korra's companion in the follow-up series. It's just fascinating to me that even though the sketch is from 2002, the character of Naga still makes a comeback a decade later for the legend of Korra. Let's also look at another early sketch that was included in an art book for the series. Here we can see the creators expand on the early inspiration for Aang and Avatar as a whole. We see robot monkey Momo again, and a little more of Aang's staff. The show was originally thought up as a futuristic sci-fi type of adventure, but later shifted to the setting we know now. Interestingly, Aang didn't really have a name in the beginning, only Wind Boy or Buddha Boy. only later being referred to as the Keystone Being. You can pause and read the rest of this screenshot if you want. I bet this entire book is really a pretty good read. Anyways, I love how the character developed from a rough idea to the one that we saw in the series. And despite some major changes, the creators had a vision for Aang that was unwavering all the way from the beginning. And we've also come all the way from the beginning. We've finally made it to the end of the iceberg. If you made it this far and you haven't clicked the subscribe button, do me a favor and press it now. Let me know in the comments what your favorite topic was, and let me know your own theories. I'm sure there are some great ones out there, and I love seeing what stories people have made up. Lastly, if you're looking for more Vault content, I've got other videos on my channel exploring the lore behind some popular series like Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, Star Wars, and Pokemon. With that, thanks for watching the Avatar Iceberg, and I'll see you next time.